Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lavina Iyer. I'm the Global Tech and Telecoms Analyst at Economist Intelligence. Today, we'll be discussing Finance Assistant of the Future. Before I come to the panel, I spend a lot of my time trying to understand what big tech companies are up to. My colleague as well, Dexter, who you've seen earlier in the day, we spend a lot of time understanding what different regulators across the world are thinking about emerging technologies like AI. And personally, I've spent a lot of time, I'm sure a lot of you have as well, experimenting with Gen AI models, frankly, just trying to keep up with Gen AI models. Our panel here has done something similar, where they're trying to meaningfully find ways where AI tools, not just Gen AI, but other machine learning algorithms and more mature cases can meaningfully enhance productivity, at the same time ensure that these are safe and credible outputs that they can rely on for business decisions. So each of them have a unique approach to innovation, adoption, at the same time skilling. And that's what we'll focus on today. So very quickly, I'd like to introduce the panel. We have, starting from my left, Jarek Warnowski, Vice President, Global Business Services Management, Pandora. We have Jaki Badenhorst, Head of Software Engineering, Performance Insights Center of Excellence at NatWest. We have Shane Afolabi, Head of Pre-Sales, Wolters and Kluwer. And we have Michelle Lamar, Finance Director, Corporate Development Strategies at Base Systems. Online, we also have Rajiv Jain, Leader Finance Operations Transformation at HP, and Priyanka Singhal, Vice President AI Transformation at US Bank. So as you can see, a diverse set of industries, diverse set of roles. So let's dig right into it then. Jaki, I'd like to begin with you. I'm sure through the day we've talked about chat-based assistants, but you've told me something very interesting that you've done at NatWest. So how about we start with some of the more popular use cases and applications of AI and Gen AI at your organization and other things you've seen elsewhere?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here today. The one thing just to pre-position as well before I talk as well, so as well as being at NatWest, I also so I sit on a council for the Institute of Chartered Accountants for Scotland and lead their AI working group. So both with the lens from NatWest and that, I've kind of managed to see quite a lot of what's happening across industry. And I think one of the things which is interesting about how finance functions are looking at adopting AI is that in some respects, it's actually slightly harder to do it in finance functions because of a lot of the requirements of accuracy, timeliness, and the kind of the trust aspect of it. But when it comes to chat assistants at NatWest and other organizations, one of the interesting uses of the kind of chat assistant is that kind of having the ability to interrogate knowledge. Because I think that's the one thing that's quite unique with generative AI and large language models that is introduced. So it's that ability to interact with complex knowledge sets, especially for newer colleagues and people who are joining an organization, to be able to interact with those. But it's more advanced than what it has been in the past by being able to answer on the kind of contextual information. Now, one thing that I've definitely noticed as well is when you start taking your finance knowledge, be it policies or processes, and you make that available to a wider business group, these AI assistants effectively become an abstraction layer between the business and what is complex in finance. So if you ask someone, please complete a capitalization assessment process for intangible assets, that is a very, very heavy finance thing. But if you ask a business person to do that, they would struggle to even know where to start. And there's always that kind of bit of, I'm worried I'm going to ask a stupid question. But an AI assistant doesn't care if it's stupid or not. They'll just answer it based on what you're asking, and they can assist you through that. So it means that when the business has done that process and then speaks to finance, it's a much more of a holistic conversation.
Absolutely, that's great. It's also something I think most companies have progressed to, from the basic chat assistant customer facing to more knowledge models that you feed in, context that you feed in, and it's a model that keeps learning. So it's great. Jarek, I'd like you to tell us a bit more about what you did at Pandora. I know you said a bit about predictive analysis and some of the use cases you've had along over there. So what's been your journey? How have you developed that? At the same time, what's the level of confidence and comfort that your team now shares with these solutions?
Look, first and foremost, pleasure to be here and meet you all. I think it's a super interesting topic to have, and obviously everyone is thinking how we can use technology to be better in predicting the future, and that is super important for finance as well. Look, to me, it all really starts with also how your finance team is being positioned in the company and what is the vision of it. So I'll try to be quite low practical so you guys can kind of get a feeling on how we've been making different decisions. So in Pandora, the vision for finance is that we want to co-pilot execution of strategy. So not just being good business partners, which like is sitting on the back of the taxi and being driven by the general management and seeing how things work and helping with few numbers. It's more really about being in the front seat and driving it. If we take that, we took another conscious decision. So we said that we want to allow finance people to really be augmented by technology. So give them the access to AI. Mm-hmm. So when we look at AI, and our finance team, it's few hundreds of people. Let's be brutally honest, not everyone will be a master of universe in prompting, and not everyone will be super critical in looking at the inputs they get back from the technology. So realizing this, we think about it this way: it has to be simple and reliable. And then when you think about simple and reliable, and you look at the market, you look at your finance function and what can be done, you quickly discover that there is a set of tools which is based on, or has been built, or is heavily based on language models, which are great, but they have not really been developed primarily to do, mathematical analysis and so on. So you discover it's not fully reliable. And then on the other side, there are fantastic applications which are all about machine learning, which is great because it helps us with the backlog of our unstructured data that we have from the past. But unfortunately, it also costs quite a lot, which impacts ROI. So I think one of the things, the way that we try to dig into this is we kind of looked at finance in two different sets. One is FP&A and commercial finance, which is all about agility, driving top line, building scenarios. And there we work quite closely with a couple of suppliers that we've been associated with from the past. We're trying to get on their growth trajectory with regards to AI. So we're not making huge investments there in terms of building things in-house. But instead, as it was advised in a couple of panels, we're trying to find a few things that will make, for example, reporting simpler and faster, more accurate. On the other side, just to give you something which I also find quite interesting, is you have all the balance sheet and compliance, right? And when you talk about balance sheet, you frequently ask questions like, what sits on your balance sheet? Which kind of says, it kind of immediately points the discussion to the past. What if we could have a model that is going to answer a question, what should be sitting on your balance sheet, instead of what sits on your balance sheet, what should be sitting in your balance sheet, what you should expect to see there in a couple of months, in 2 quarters, given the input that you expect to see from FP&A and commercial finance. So we're trying to kind of break the equilibrium there a little bit. And I think whatever you asked, what is the state of adoption, I think whatever works makes people excited. So there's nothing better, not a better motivator than a success story there. Just closing this, I think it's interesting also for the future, because if you guys think about your finance teams, in the past we were hiring for FP&A, hiring for commercial finance, hiring for accounting, compliance. It's going to be super interesting actually in the future. Are we still going to think about it this way? Or are we going to go after a rounded finance professional who has completely different skills, more focused on reading and interacting with AI rather than being siloed into one of the old school buckets in finance?
Well, clearly, it's not going to be old school. We are going to all have to keep up, and I know we're all itching to also talk about the skilling question, which we'll come to a little further. Before we move along to that, though, Shane, you've had conversations with a lot of clients and stakeholders, and frankly, finance was one of the sectors which, when we tracked with clients, we realized are very risk averse. So they're very critical of some of the outputs that Gen AI was putting out. Of course, now adoption has increased, but you do have to flag any output that comes in from an AI-generated model. So what's the level of comfort? What's the level of confidence? What's the learning path like?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because across all of our customer bases, we've always found right at the start of our AI conversations with them, there's a little bit of resilience. and that resilience is normal. If you think about where we all were 20 years ago with the advent of Excel, or probably even 30 years ago, people were still very resilient about moving. All they were doing on pen and paper, I think we heard that being spoken here, is moving on to a computer-based system. Moving on to Excel, and then moving from Excel to an FP&A system, and then moving from an FP&A system to an AI-enabled FP&A system is a big journey. And for some of our customers, what we've learned is that the journey actually starts with the leadership, right at the top. Where we've seen success with our customers is where the CFO or the finance director has a case for change, and that case for change is around them making their businesses or their finance function more accurate when it comes to forecasting. So within our business, Wolters Kluwer, we have a specific product that we help businesses use for FP&A around consolidation and budgeting and forecasting. And when we speak to them about how we use AI for budgeting and forecasting, they're usually a little bit unsure whether they should go ahead to put all their information, all their data into this black box, and they're not sure what's going to come out of it. And what we try and educate our customers is that, first of all, it's not a black box. And I think there was a conversation here about a data scientist versus not data scientist. You do not have to be a data scientist to actually use an AI product. In fact, a lot of the products on the market that you find these days around finance or helping finance users, they are usually no code. And so you don't have to be a data scientist. You have the option to be able to understand, and the AI itself is explainable. So with our products, you have an explainable outcome. So you're not just putting all your data into this black box and you don't understand what's coming out of it. So as I mentioned, the leadership has been key for adoption. The push has been from the top. And the second thing that I would say that we've seen is where it's been successful, they've started small. There's a single use case that they're trying to achieve. They're not trying to fix the entire part of their finance function. It might be that they're trying to predict net turnover for a specific business function across a bunch of drivers. And so what we usually say is, you don't need to go and look at 600 or 700 external factors. Concentrate on what you know. You might have 15 or 20 external drivers that you use for your plan. Let's start there. We can put all of that into the AI, and we can use that to do things like anomaly detection, outlier detection, and we've got a bunch of other things that we do, and I can explain that a bit more. But that's where we start. Start small and use that as a case for change to then build up. But I think the biggest thing is that the leadership, it comes from the top. That's how the adoption gets pushed through.
If I can maybe just build on something that James was saying there, because I think something you touched on there, which I think is really important, is that expectation versus reality as well. Because I think a lot of people, when they look at the use cases initially, they have a high expectation of it's going to do something up here. And if you look at like Copilot, Microsoft Copilot as something that's been rolled out in a lot of organizations, people's initial expectation is going to do all of these wonderful things. But when they start using it, it's that kind of gap. Now, you can go one of two ways. You can either say, oh, it's rubbish, or you could say, right, I'll reframe my expectation and build up from there. But I think you're absolutely right. Start with something, get that right, and then build on that with a realistic expectation as well.
Of course, Michelle. I think this is a great way for you to talk about the AI accelerator, where the idea is you're trying to identify these different applications and also encourage creativity. At the same time, getting people comfortable at your organization. So I'm curious to know how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. BAE Systems is a global defense prime. Obviously, in the defense industry, there's a huge amount of technological change that's underway. So we see it within our customers and in the conflict environment. And our leadership team is certainly, to Shane's point, bought into ensuring that we, as an organization, remain agile and adapt ourselves as well. So our leadership team is very supportive of trialing and experimenting with new types of technologies. Within our Chief Technology and Information Office, we have an AI accelerator, where there's a pot of funds that are kind of available, where different sectors and functions put their ideas together with a business case that sits behind them to pitch their opportunities to this accelerator fund to trial out different capabilities. That fund is really focused on three different things. It's about sort of business operational improvements. It's about improving our engineering design and manufacturing capability, as well as improving our kind of products and services that we provide to our customers' environment. And we've got a number of different use cases, a couple in finance around cash flow management, as well as tax filings, which have been touched on in various different panels, as well as broader applicability to our business. So.
That's great. So we've had this wide range of use cases, and I'm sure you've heard about it through the day as well. But the bit that I find tricky when I'm thinking about it within my own company, within my own team, is how do you actually measure some of the effectiveness, both in terms of costs and in terms of just time saved? What are some of the key criteria that you're looking at? The accuracy part of it, the depth of insight, the relevance. So Rajiv, I'm curious to know, how do you think companies should be going about this? Is there a framework? Are there 3 or 4 criteria that you think stand out when finance teams are evaluating, is this the right solution? Is this something we should be backing?
Yeah, I mean, I start always to think about, what is the outcome you expect from any solution, right? Both at a local level as well as for the larger organization or the enterprise. At a local level, the usual suspects about measuring ROI, cost of investment versus cost avoided or cost saved, right? I mean, you can always use that, and that's what goes on at each project level. But then I also encourage all of us, and I advocate the thought of saying, look, there is a certain level of investment you need to make for your longer term results, right? I like to give this example, right? If you're building a large building, which will have a huge ROI at the end of the day, which is only a projection, obviously, right? You cannot measure the ROI of every individual basement and floor and everything, or the foundation separately. Or I've laid the foundation, show me the ROI. It's not going to work that way. So take a judgment call as leadership on saying, okay, what is that minimum investment or optimum investment I need for longer term continued results, and uplifting my infrastructure in terms of AI usage, deployment, and business impact. So that's one. So 2-3 things, right? That's what I'm saying. One, of course, continue to measure each project on its own ROI in traditional way and take those calls. But also take a longer term view on saying, what is that investment I need to make, which I will measure in the longer run in terms of overall effectiveness of the organization. Efficiency, effectiveness, and experience, all the 3 are important. You probably will have to put a model in place. Again, leverage AI if you want to use there, right? To see, okay, how is that going to look like? Predict that outcome, and then make those judgments. I think we're all figuring these things out as we go along. There's no perfect model out there. Efficiency or cost related pieces are easy to calculate, but they are myopic. They need to be expanded. So that's how I see this landscape. So much of benefit is in terms of even being able to play in the field, right? You don't want to be an organization or a finance function, or to that extent, any function who does not have the capability of leveraging AI going forward in your business models, in your delivery models, and in your measurements. You have to have those. If you don't, you're going to miss out on big opportunities or making an impact on your customers and your enterprise. So look at ROI from that perspective.
Interesting. I like your point that this is a framework that we're constantly going to develop, because 2 years ago we were talking about ChatGPT, now we're talking about agentic AI. I'm sure we're going to come up with another buzzword by the end of the year. But while we're thinking about AI, I think it's very important that we talk about the challenges that not just finance, but other sectors have discovered, which is the challenge of biases and how do you overcome and how do you put safeguards in place. Yes, we want our employees to play with AI tools, but we want to ring fence it in an environment that it's not feeding a public model. So Priyanka, I know you've worked on a lot of it when you were in the research department, and you talked about encouraging leadership to help with some of the POCs, and then you moved it along with adoption to teams. So what are some of those guidelines that you've developed at your organization as you experiment and adopt AI?
Yeah, I'll begin by saying I'm happy to be here, and also a disclaimer that all these views are my personal views and no bearings to my organization. So great question, Lina. And I think a couple of the previous speakers also covered that it's very, very important that we don't go blind when it comes to AI implementations, and don't rush into implementing everything at scale and try to change everything at once. It's very important to go small. And in my personal view, POCs go a long way because the pace at which technology is changing currently is very fast. So you don't want to invest too much in one direction and then realize, things have moved forward. So I think POC development, start with one problem, one department, solve it with a POC very quickly, with an agile methodology. I don't like to say that word, but yeah, like quickly develop something, see if there is value to it. Again, it blends into the ROI question also a little bit, where it's very hard to very quickly see what is going to be the impact. But a POC can at least guide you into seeing whether it's even valuable or not. Are all the stakeholders thinking in the same way, and is the end product of any use? And then go and build it further. Also, from a compliance perspective, it is very helpful. It is very important to have all your compliance teams along the way when you're presenting the POC and then taking it forward. As you see value, bias, compliance, everything is being met, only then you scale it further. So that's the approach I would recommend.
I like your point on compliance. Given that regulation with regard to AI tools itself is evolving, and we'll touch upon the EU AI Act, and we've had a couple of headlines with regard to it, so it'll be interesting to get your perspective. But I'm curious to know how you think about adopting AI within teams. How do you give your colleagues, your finance teams, the confidence that this is not a tool that's going to replace them tomorrow, but instead it's going to support them? How do you help them overcome that fear? How do you encourage them to play with tools that don't necessarily need coding, but can leverage some of the technical expertise they have in their existing jobs? So, Yaki, if we could begin, with what you've done at NatWest.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, it's quite a loaded question. There's a lot in there. I suppose there's a couple of things that other people have touched on that I think is quite important to frame with this, because so we've spoken about kind of proof of concepts, we've spoken about investments, which, to be honest, all of those things are quite important with actually giving people the access to these things. Mm-hmm. So I think that's probably the first thing. If your colleagues don't have access to these tools in work, then firstly, you're exposing yourself to actually them using it outside of work for work purposes, which is a kind of a big problem in of itself. But so if I kind of almost take it step by step. So if we think about the investment piece that was discussed earlier, now, one way I've heard generative AI described before, which I actually agree with, is if you think about when electricity was first invented, it was this thing that was there that people saw value in, but they didn't actually know what to do with it. But until the whole electricity network was built, it's only at that point that it's now effectively part of everything we do. It's kind of all around us. But it required that investment before you could really see it come to fruition. So you do need that upfront investment of some description that you can actually have access to start with. Mm-hmm. And then once you have access, you can do your proof of concepts. But a big bugbear I have in industry is, I've seen thousands of proof of concepts, but if I think about the number that have actually made it all the way to production for multiple different reasons, I think that turnaround rate is far too low. Now, some of them have fallen away for good reason, mm-hmm. but if you don't have the infrastructure, the proof of concepts, and then the strategy, so that you have a common strategic objective that you are trying to work towards. So my personal view is, if you don't have a strategic view that you're trying to head to as an organization or as a function, then you first need to do that. And you should not do any proof of concept that does not directly play into your objectives, because if it doesn't play into those, don't touch it. It's a waste of time. So focus on things that you can do. Focus on things that, by the fact that the pure nature that they feed into your objectives, they will bring value. Now, if you have all of that, it makes it so much easier to actually enable colleagues, because they can then see this thing I'm using is kind of working towards that common objective. But as part of that, there's also the journey of, and I believe this will be one of the future questions as well, is that paradigm shift of how do you get people on this journey and how do you educate them? Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned Excel earlier as well. Now, if I was to ask you what's the value of Excel to businesses, you would struggle to kind of put a financial value on it because it's fingers and toes. But when Excel was first brought out, in loads of organizations, they had multi-year programs to upskill people in how to use Excel as well. And it's a similar kind of approach that you probably need. But the key thing is access first. Because if you don't have that, then you're going to be struggling.
Absolutely. Jarek, what were some of those objectives that you were thinking about when you encouraged your employees to play around? And was it more focused? Was it more let's experiment and, like an AI competition or a boot camp? What was it like?
Yeah, I think I'll be happy to answer that in just a second, just reflecting on what you have said. Because
Please disagree with me. Feel free to disagree.
I actually think that, look, we can talk about AI like we could be closed in this room and we sit here for a week and we would not run out of topics probably because everyone could chip in with a valid input. But it's a real thing that you have to start in a very focused way. You have to have an idea. You don't even have to call it a huge strategy, but you need to have a need. You need to have an idea where you want to start. Otherwise, it's super difficult to make it tangible from the financial perspective. The way that we have done it in Pandora is right about after ChatGPT has arrived, and it has become quite clear that it's here to stay, and it's a beginning of the revolution. We have actually started with a proper educational program for our senior leadership and executive leadership. I mean, it's funny how many of you guys have seen a movie called Inception with Leonardo DiCaprio. Have you seen it? Yeah. It was I still watch it on the flights, right? It was a really good movie. But that movie was essentially about a bunch of guys who were trying to steal secrets from heads of executives or plant them ideas that then they would turn into action, right? And then there was a lot of FX about that. I mean, if you think about the situation we're having with technology, if you have a board that's not educated, you can literally have people who give away confidential information to the technology that is afterwards going to feed back to you an idea that you're going to go and realize, right? And you still save a lot of money on Leonardo DiCaprio and you make it in practice. Unfortunately, it all goes wrong. But educating your board and senior leadership is also creating a burning platform, which I think someone in the previous panel has mentioned. It creates a need, and then it goes down into the organization. So what we're doing in our company, I mean, there's a continuous program for leadership, so people understand what it's all about. How do we want to do this in Pandora? What kind of technologies we're using, what we're not using. That's also to be clearly said, and for what reasons. But then we kind of segmented people who work with AI. So we have a general awareness training so people understand that even if they play with things at home for their own personal usage, they know what's safe, what's not safe, but also technology they have available at work, they understand what the boundaries are. And then we have a different, more gamification type of application for those who actively work with AI to kind of raise their creativity. And then finally, we have a small team, which is kind of a task force. So if I'm working on something and that needs to be amplified or they need help, then we have someone physically coming and helping. But what this is really all about, if you think about it, it's really about teaching people how to read and write again. I mean, we've been talking about prompting and, I mean, prompting is literally how to write. We're teaching people how to write again so that technology can properly respond. And then we're teaching them how to read again, being critical about what they get on the screen. And I think this is what is really fascinating about what we're going through, because as you guys hire people, I mean, I'm not going to ask you if you hire people who know how to read and write. Obviously, you do. But do they actually know how to read and write in terms of technology? That's a separate, interesting topic.
That ties in very nicely to the question that I want to ask about skilling. So I know prompting was one aspect that we know about very well, but as AI applications mature in terms of their use cases, we're talking about forecasting, predictive analysis. Shane, I know you've talked to me about some of the clients and the journeys that they've been on, from resistance to then being trained and then adopting it full on. How has that worked for you?
I think, Michelle, did you have a question?
Well, I was actually just going to add on to the last question. I don't mean to jump in.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to say, in terms of adaptation of technology in our workforce, I mean, at least the defense industry is just booming at the moment and really growing at incredible rates. And we are in a huge recruitment mode, as well as having an aging workforce. So we are just like running to stand still, essentially. from a workforce. So anything that kind of increases efficiency is going to be like a godsend to the employee base. And I think, in particular, when you think about finance professionals, and it was touched on earlier about some risk aversion there, that confidence in ensuring that that technology delivers an accurate outcome, because, we need to make decisions based on accurate information. And the ability of those AI techs to actually point back to sourcing, to say where is, not all sourcing is the same. Some sources are more trustworthy than others. And us being able to have that confidence because the sourcing of how that output was driven was of high quality. So I think that's probably a bit more trickier that we're trying to get our heads around. So.
Yes, and I think one of the skill sets, which I'm sure Shane you'll touch upon, that ties in well with what you said, Michelle, is ensuring that people using these applications know how these models actually work. So to have a sense of what's going in, how's it feeding, how's it making that decision. So Shane, I'll not take away from what
No problem at all. I think JC actually made a really good point about adoption, which was it's not enough to have AI in your hands and use it outside of work. I'm sure we all have at some point have used ChatGPT on our phones or Googled or used Gemini or Bard in some respect. I think actually what's really interesting is whether you're using it at work. So there's Microsoft Copilot, the various different types of AI agents that you can use. Outlook, I tried to configure one the other day for just changing the colors of my calendar meetings from red to green. And that's something you can do today. And that's an AI agent that actually exists. I think that kind of adoption, it's really small, it's quite repetitive, but it's automating a manual task. It starts to put in the minds of your staff, of the people within your finance teams, how to use AI. It's solving a problem. There's an outcome to the thing that you're trying to do, but it starts to, you can actually feel and realize that it's quite tangible. So it's a very small thing, but it gets into the minds of the people that you're working with, the idea of adoption. So I think actually, forgetting about for a second the big problem that you're trying to solve in finance and just using it for little day-to-day tasks is a good way to start. Where I've had a lot of exposure around how we use AI around predictive intelligence and predictive analytics, the finance team actually never go away. So we refer to it as the human-in-the-loop system or an AI model. And that means when we start using the AI model, we start by training the model. So we do, within Wolters Kluwer, within our AI products, everything that we do starts with a train and then an execute. So train, it trains the model, execute, it executes the model to predict whatever variable or outcome that you're looking to do. The human is always going to be involved, either within the training, because they're the ones that provide the data, they're the ones who go and look for those variables or those external or internal factors. They know their job better than anyone else. They're in the FP&A team, they've been doing this job for years. They understand the data. What the computer helps them to do is recognize patterns in the data. So they may know, I know that to predict sales volume, discount rates, seasonality is always going to play a part, but they may not know how much those two variables play a part. What's the strength of the feature importance? Or what are their other variables? It might be inflation rate has a big impact, or maybe even COVID. So we've done a few POCs where we've run models to try and predict sales volume, and we've taken 30 or 40 variables that exist in the company at the time, and then we've introduced external variables, and we didn't realize actually that some of the things that we introduced were of stronger feature importance than the variables that the company already had. So of course, with the team, in terms of being able to understand how that works, we said to them, start small. Start with what you know, start with the variables that you currently collect, and then use the tool to build it out. And the beauty of what the AI actually does is, once you start that process of being able to train the model, with the variables that you have, it will tell you there's 80% explanation based on what you've put into this model, which means you know there's a 20% gap. So with that information that the system's given you, you now, as an individual, as a human working in that FP&A team, should go out and look for what are the other variables that might be having an effect on my data. So the human will never be replaced. The intelligence of the FP&A team is still required. Being good at what you do is absolutely still required. So in terms of skilling, I go back to what JC said, I think the adoption, start with utilizing AI on a day-to-day basis. That sets your mindset around how I can utilize these systems. Then putting it into an actual business use in finance, it becomes a hand in glove. You're already doing what you do on a daily basis. You're now thinking about how do I use this machine to augment and help me with my day-to-day job. So I think those are the two things, and I think they fit together quite nicely. And we've definitely seen them working with the few POCs that we've done, is that the FP&A team are still very involved from training the model to executing the model. And then the end of it is, how do you explain the results? Well, I think I mentioned black box a while ago. But what's really important is, once you've done all this model training and you've done the execution, does the AI actually tell you what it's done? Does it explain to you that the variable's missing, that this one's more important than the other? Does it then tell you, in order to predict this thing that you're trying to predict, this is the band of confidence that it has? And then can you then use that to go ahead and do a forecast? So all of those things, I think, are additive to skilling up.
Interesting. So I like the way that you talked about the human oversight, and of course, if we started talking about the augmented workforce, but we may have to extend this by a few more minutes. So we have a panel about it tomorrow. So please do join us for that. But staying on the skilling question, Rajiv, I want to come to you. Since the pandemic, we've seen this acceleration of digital transformation. And I remember even in my organization, we had to interact with product teams and engineering teams while we were developing. I'm from a journalistic background, an editorial solution. With finance colleagues, what are the skill sets they're expected? What are the processes that they must familiarize themselves with, as they are also part of this AI solution or AI product development? Are there any such processes that you think are relevant for colleagues today in the finance teams?
Processes, I think, is one question, right? Which is about, okay, do you have, we all tend to gravitate to the word governance, right? So that everything happens in the right way. But to start with, first of all, I like to start with a Play-Doh mindset, as I call it. You allow people to play in risk-free environments with the new tools which you have, and then let them figure out how to bend these tools in the right way for their consumption. You do it in a guarded rail environment, so that you let people touch and feel. Oh, here is a Gen AI, here is a Copilot, here is a ChatGPT. How can I use this in my current business situation? And do I have an idea which I can use it with, and then build a prototype and then experiment with it and learn from that experience? And, when you talk about adoption and the processes around, one is allowing and creating an environment for those kind of risk-free experimentation with gaming and competition, and some of my colleagues have talked about that really. And we've done that in the earlier part when we were encouraging all pre-AI kind of, which is today part of AI, as all of us talk about, digital enhancements of people's capabilities, right, and ability to impact the business. Now, in terms of skills, I link these two very, very closely. I see the skills being three kinds, right? You need to have people with ability to build solutions. Once I know what I want to build, there should be technical ability available to build the solution and then implement it, run it, right? There's also an ability required, or a skill required, to spot those opportunities. How do I know this is a good case for use of AI? For example, our people in our collections organization identified that the dunning, which they do for, a long tail of customers, which a collector is physically not able to reach personally, is pretty large number for a large organization like us. And then, they built a AI solution which goes into the systems on its own, pulls out all those customers against whom we have AR outstanding, and then create communications, and then without human touch or minor human touch, reach out to the customers with a follow-up dunning, and then link it back with the database as well, to make sure that no customer is left untouched in terms of collection efforts, right? Now, these kind of low-risk solutions need to be identified. So that's skill number 2. Where do I spot the opportunity? And third is, which some of us have talked about already, is, okay, I have a solution and I need to be able to use it on a day-to-day basis. How do I make myself comfortable with it? And that, I believe, is not just a training situation. It's also about trusting the solution. And imagine you are sitting, or you and I are sitting in we really want a truly self-driven car, and we want to sit inside without putting our paddle on, our foot on the imaginary paddle, be comfortable to sit in a fully self-driven car. Similarly, as people use Excel today, as some of us talked about, with total confidence, we know what it is doing. For us and our people to believe the solutions, they have to trust what AI is doing. And for that, they need to know what how AI is working. So if you can help people learn how is it working, how does the solution really work in the back end, they will start trusting it more. And so creating an environment and processes to make that happen is crucial as well. So the trust is the backbone of everything. Then create a Play-Doh environment, and then give them opportunity to create solutions and compete and learn from the experience, and then figure out finally how do you implement it on the ground and take people's input. I believe when you involve people, I have this total augmented intelligence TAI kind of a model. When you involve people in all these solutions, you really start getting their full support.
Perfect. Again, we're reaching the close of our session, so if anyone has any questions, I'll come to you in a bit. But I want to talk about the compliance question, because we've seen that the EU AI Act, for instance, is at the forefront of regulating artificial intelligence. And I know, Jarek, you have some very interesting, diverse opinions about it. We've seen that there are talks of diluting some of those regulations, especially with regard to what's happening geopolitically for US tech companies. So, Jarek, I'm keen to understand, how are you thinking about it when you're developing these solutions at Pandora? What are you worried about? What are you confident about?
Yeah, look, I don't really think it's about Pandora or any other particular enterprise here in the room. It's about principles, right? So this technology has started in Silicon Valley, pretty much. We can say it, but it's really an advancement that has been made by humanity. I mean, people came to Silicon Valley from places, so it started there, and now we have it on American terms. Let's call it like this. But if you think about running business and regulation that comes into a place, and you as a CFO or CXO board member, you are about to make a decision. You have two people bidding with a product to you. One of them is saying it's a fantastic product, it's going to cost you X. I mean, it does not, in terms of privacy and everything around that, we work on a best case basis. And then you have someone else who comes in and says like, okay, it's not as good as the previous one. Maybe it's 5% slower, 3% less accurate. Maybe it's also 5% more expensive, but here's everything. Here's the package on how it's going to work. Here's what it's going to do with your data. Here is how it's going to process it. It's about the ethics of running business, which I personally, it's a personal view, I think it's just going to prevail. And ultimately, the way I look at regulation, obviously you cannot overdo it, because then you're just going to choke the business to death, and that's it. But if you do it gradually, I think what we have seen historically happening is regulation appears in one place, then it's going to be a competitive advantage in some ways as well. And then it's going to appear in another place, and then things will get themselves on average on a global scale. It's just going to take a bit of time. But I personally don't see this as a threat to the way that AI will be developing in Europe. It's not a handbrake. It's also not an accelerator, but it can be used as a competitive advantage in many ways, because it anchors your business within certain rules which are clear, transparent, and understandable for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Michelle, I'm curious. Defense, clearly an area where you're putting up with a lot of regulation. So as I know you said that it's at a very early stage with the AI accelerator, and you're still identifying what solutions. But what are some of the key points that you'll be keeping in mind as the regulatory environment evolves globally? And every geography is going to be at a very different stage.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we comply with the Geneva Convention. So we're all good there. Governance is absolutely critical BAE systems and compliance. I mean, the government is our main customer in various different regions. So with each region that we operate within, we comply with those regulations. And right now, as you said, we are in the process of piloting different technologies as we go along. But certainly in the finance function, I don't think there's any risk of us potentially breaching anything there. So we should be all good.
Okay. Before I come for my closing remarks to each of the panelists, any questions from the audience? Oh, there we have one.
Hi, Habiba Hussain from HSBC. Thanks everyone for talking today. So this question is probably more aimed to you, Jackie, but something on the back of what you've said, Shane, as well on skilling. So we talked a lot about skilling on AI, right, and building our knowledge there. Just a slightly different lens on it. So a typical CFO these days, right? So I'm saying typical, I know it's not the pathway for everyone, but it's accountancy. So you do your accountancy exam, you work as an analyst, you work up manager, senior manager, director, eventually you're in the C-suite as a CFO. But you're only there as a CFO because of those fundamental years as an analyst and manager doing that grunt work. Now, from what we've been hearing today, AI, particularly agentic AI, is potentially going to take over that kind of analyst manager layer, right? Because it can make the decisions going forward. So how are we thinking about the missing skill set then in business experience for those CFOs in the future to be able to challenge AI because they won't have built their knowledge from doing the grunt work?
Yeah. Oh, do you know, I thank you so much for asking that question, actually. This is actually a topic I'm really, really passionate about. So Shane, who sits in the corner, he's in the corner there, so he's part of ICAS as well, and one of the research topics that we're looking at is called Shaping the Profession, which looks exactly at this. So what is the finance professional of the future going to look like? And if you look at something like chartered accountancy, what will you need to do to train someone to become a chartered accountant? Because what we deem as a professional, if you think about it, is what society deems as someone who has received appropriate training, has been guided and observed, has done specific benchmarks of exams, and is then accepted by society. Now, if you look at AI models, they have appropriate training, they've been guided, they've got benchmarks, and they have experience effectively. So there's a lot of, like you say rightly, there's a lot of work that we do today that over the years are going to be effectively replaced and supplanted by these. So if you look at people who trained as chartered accountants 10 years ago, the things that they had to do compared to what people are qualifying now, there's a big difference. But there's a gap of where the knowledge worker sits that has stayed consistent. But with these new systems, that is changing. And I think as a profession, it is a serious question that we do really have to front up to. And it's not to kind of say it's all doom and gloom, but it's what a chartered accountant or accountant is going to be will have to change. And the way that you train people, because I think Shane made the point about the human oversight of you have the understanding and the experience to recognize when that thing isn't there. But in 5, 10, 15 years' time, you'll have people who've never, ever, ever even have to think about what that process was. So it's going to be almost impossible for them to understand that's wrong. So it's, where do finance professionals form eventually part of that training process and of that oversight? So it's more that partnership with these systems. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that. Like I say, ICAS are doing some research on that, so you can kind of keep an eye on the research that's coming out. But it's something definitely that we, as a profession and as employers, do need to think about. Because we will reach a point where our employee base will cross over between those who've had the experience and then those who don't. And what do we do when we reach that point? Because I think it's the slight elephant in the room, because it is going to come, and we need to start thinking about it.
And if I could just add, actually, to what JC said, I think two things is going to happen. I think the first thing is the pathway to become a CFO is already changing. In 10 years, it's going to be completely different. I think the curriculum for ACCA, ICAEW will also be slightly different. I think it has to include parts of AI into it. I think being able to understand things like anomaly detection, auto mapping, at the base of an analyst, I think those types of things will absolutely have to be embedded into the training pathway that JC's mentioned. And I think the second thing, I've kind of forgotten now, that just happened.
You're on a roll. You're on a kick.
Is I'll come back to the second thing. I'll come and find you and I'll tell it to you.
So again, AI will probably become a fundamental accountancy exam.
Yeah.
But that's fine, but it's how they're missing that business experience.
Sorry, the second thing I've just remembered. It just spun a memory. So we speak to a lot of CFOs in the line of business that I'm in. And what I've actually seen over the last 7 years is the skill set of the CFOs from 7 years ago is different to the skill set of the CFOs now. In fact, what they asked for 6 years ago is different to what they ask for now. Right now, CFOs and finance directors are actually more in the detail of all the demonstrations that we give them. 7 years ago, it was okay for me to say to them, Tagetik does this. We can do your consolidation, your ESG reporting, your budgeting and forecasting. We can do it in Excel. It's all nice and good. They were happy. Today, they ask us very detailed questions around what APIs do you have? What kind of transformations do you have? Do you have automatic mapping? So they are aware already of the type of technology stack that's available. And that's today. And I can't imagine what's going to be in 5 to 6 years' time. So the skill set will absolutely change.
Perfect. If there are more questions, observations and comments, I'm sure you can find our speakers. We have a networking session that starts in a bit, but we're way over time, so I can see the screen screaming at me. So I'd like to thank everyone on the panel. Thank you, Priyanka and Rajiv, for joining us virtually. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.